Now, as you see on the screen, take your Bibles and open to the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 14, we'll look at verses 22 through 36 here this evening. If you'll remember, a couple of weeks ago when we were last in here on Sunday night, we saw Jesus feeding the 5,000 plus people. And that is the only miracle that was mentioned in all four of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of those four, three of the four tell us what happened immediately next when the storm would arise on the sea and Jesus would come walking on the water. And that would be Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke, for whatever reason, did not mention this particular story. So we are going to look at Matthew's version of Jesus walking on the water, and Matthew, Mark, and John, who each told the story. Matthew is the only one who mentioned Peter walking on the water. He's the only one. So if you look, beginning with verse 22, there it says, straightway, immediately that is, the word straightway means immediately, Jesus constrained his disciples, and the word constrained means commanded. Jesus commanded his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, that is the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he sent the multitudes away. Who were the multitudes? Of course, all those people that he had miraculously fed from the 2 fishes and 5 loaves of bread. But I want you to do something with me. I want you to go back and look at verses 13 and 14 of Matthew 14, verses 13 and 14. And there it says, when Jesus heard of it. When he heard of what? Remember, the last thing we saw was that he had heard Herod had beheaded John the Baptist, preacher. He had beheaded John the Baptist after Herodias' daughter had danced for Herod on his birthday, and he promised her he'd give her anything she would ask for. And of course, she was coached into this by her mother and persuaded by her mother to ask for the head of John the Baptist. And when Jesus heard about that, he was greatly troubled, greatly upset. Understandably so, because Jesus was very close to John the Baptist, and he also was related to him in that they were second cousins. And so he was very troubled about this, as any of us would be at the loss of a loved one, particularly in the way John the Baptist had to meet his death by way of being beheaded. And so Jesus wanted to go off and be by himself. We can understand that. When something like this, something traumatic happens to us in our life, and if we lose a loved one, very often we want to go and withdraw and be by ourselves and perhaps just talk to the Lord and have time of prayer. That is what Jesus wanted to do. He is God's son, but he was human just like us, and just like we perhaps would have feelings and want to go and be alone and talk with the Lord. That is what Jesus wanted to do. So we look at verse 13 of chapter 14. It says, when Jesus heard of it, that is the beheading of his second cousin John the Baptist, he departed by ship into a desert place apart. But when he got there, it says the people had heard that where he was at, so they followed him by foot out of the cities, and Jesus got extremely angry and upset, right? No, he did not. It says, to the contrary, it says exactly the opposite. Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and what did it say? It says he was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. What does that say about Jesus? How would we feel if someone we're very close to met a very untimely death and a very terrible way of dying, and we just feel like we want to go and be alone by ourselves and pray And then all of a sudden, here comes a bunch of people who have needs, and we can help meet those needs spiritually for them. How would we feel? Would we be upset, or would we say, look, you have spiritual needs that I can help you with, and I'm here to assist you in any way I can? Jesus is the example for all of us to follow. As he did not bicker, he did not complain, he was not visibly upset, he outwardly showed his love as he was moved with compassion toward them. But he still, though, needed that time alone with God, the Father. He still needed that time with his Father. He still was seeking that time, even after feeding the 5,000. Now we see here that he gets his chance to go and be alone. He desired so much to be alone with the Father and talk to him. So it says in verse 22, straightway or immediately, Jesus constrained or he commanded his disciples to get into a ship. Why did he command the disciples to get into a ship? To understand this, we need to look at all three of the narratives here. We need to look at all three of the gospel stories. Again, like I said, Luke does not tell us what happened here, but Matthew, Mark, and John did. John told us in John chapter 6, verse 14, John said this, that those men, when they saw the miracle that Jesus had done of the feeding of the 5,000 plus from the 2 fishes and the 5 loaves of bread, when they saw the miracles that Jesus did, they said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. What prophet? Well, the Israelites had always known that there would be a prophet who would come sent by God. And they knew this because of what Moses had written down in his book, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, where God said, I will raise up for them, Israel that is, a prophet from among their brethren. Like unto thee, he's speaking to Moses, God was, and he said, I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I command him. So God told Moses, I will raise up a prophet, and I will give him the words to say. And when Jesus was healing people and feeding the 5,000, many of the people said, he's the one. Perhaps he is that prophet that was to come. So in John chapter 6, verse 15, it says, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force. Hear that? Jesus perceived that the crowd was going to take him by force and make him a king. He departed then unto a mountain himself alone. So John just elaborates a little bit deeper here than Matthew does and tells us the reason why Jesus commanded the disciples to get into the boat and why he went on up into a mountain to be alone with the Father is because he perceived, he understood, he realized, he knew that the crowd was going to try to force him to be a king. And he is the king, but it was not the time for him to be the king as they had sought. So then we see, verse 23 says he sent the multitudes away. That is the crowd of people. Now, of course, the disciples had said prior to feeding them, send the multitudes away, that they may go and buy themselves victuals, that they may go and buy themselves food. And Jesus said, no, don't send them away. Let's feed them first. And now after he fed them, he says, send them away. And he did. So they all go their separate ways. And it says that he then went up unto the mountain to pray. He went up there not to just recline and relax. He did not go up there to take a nap, to sleep. He did not go up there just to rest. He went up to the mountain not to just hike or anything of that nature. No. He went up to the mountain for one reason and one reason only, and that was to pray. And do you know that with us and all the things that we go through in life, that Jesus prays for us? He prays through his Holy Spirit for you and I. You know, even if we don't know how to pray for ourselves and our own situation and all the troublesome waters that we are in life, if we don't know how to pray for ourselves, we can rest assured of knowing that Jesus is praying for us. He's always praying for us. He's at the right hand of the throne of the Father. The Spirit prays for us, and the Spirit and Jesus are praying for you and I, even when we don't know how to pray for ourselves, and they're taking these prayers directly to the Father. That is awesome to know and to think about. That sends a chill down my spine, folks. If it doesn't send a chill down your spine, then something is wrong. Hey, let's look at it. It says that he went up to that mountain apart to pray. See that? Verse 23. All right, so he goes up to the mountain apart to pray, and when the evening was come, he was there alone. Now, let me tell you that the Israelites divided their days and their nights into 4 watches. Starting at 6 o'clock in the morning was the first watch of the day, from 6 until 9. 9 until 12 noon was the second watch, and 12 noon until 3 was the third, and from 3 o'clock p.m. until 6 o'clock p.m. was the fourth. Then comes night. Night would begin for them at 6 o'clock. From 6 until 9 is the first watch of the night. From 9 until midnight is the second watch. From 12 until 3 a.m. is the third, and from 3 a.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning is the fourth watch of the night. So just keep that in mind. There's a reason why I want you to keep it in your mind. It says that the ship was now in the midst of is in the evening rather, in the latter part of verse 23. It's now evening, which means it was probably in the first watch, somewhere between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. in the evening. The ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. Let me tell you about the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee was actually not really an ocean water sea. It was actually a freshwater lake. It was 13 miles long and about 7.5 to 8 miles wide. And so the disciples are in their boat, and Jesus is up on the mountain praying. He starts probably about 6 o'clock in the evening, give or take somewhere thereabout. He's up there praying. And Jesus prayed all night. For the disciples, if you would look at verse 25, see that? Verse 25 says, in the fourth watch of the night. In the fourth watch of the night, that is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., way on into the night. The disciples are in a storm in their boat. Now, the Sea of Galilee is not only a freshwater lake, it's not that big, but the Sea of Galilee is known to be the lowest freshwater lake in the world. It's 700 feet below sea level, surrounded by mountains that were as high as 4,000 feet. So you're looking at the bottom where that sea is at to the top of the mountains about 4,700 feet, almost 5,000 feet. The cold air would come down from the top of the mountains and meet the warm air on the sea. And when the cold air and the warm air would collide, there would be instant storms on the Sea of Galilee. Those fishermen knew about those storms as they had endured many a storm. And remember, I think it was in Matthew 4, maybe Mark 8, I'm not sure, but I could get those scriptures wrong, but I think in Matthew 4 you'd find this. The disciples were on the boat, and Jesus was in that ship asleep, as another such time, that they were in a storm. This time, Jesus wasn't in the boat with them, but they weren't alone as he was praying for them. They were on his mind. Just like you and I, whatever we're going through in life, we are on his mind. And we see that those disciples they had been toiling, rowing hard all night long. And do you understand this? Look, it says here, let's look at it. Let me find it. It says they were in the midst, verse 24. The ship was now in the middle of the sea. And if you remember, I said that the Sea of Galilee is only about 3.5 to 4 miles wide. If it's only 3.5 to 4 miles wide, then they had only gone about 2 miles out to the middle of the sea. And it took them from about 6 o'clock p.m. in the evening to about 3 o'clock in the morning. That means those disciples were in a frightening storm all night long, toiling and rowing as hard as they could to get to the other side, and they're stuck right out in the middle of the sea. And I don't know about you, but I remember when I was a teenager going deep sea fishing with my brother-in-law, who's in heaven today. But I remember being out in the sea and seeing nothing but seawater. That's not the most pleasant sight to see sometimes, to not see land. But these disciples were out there in the middle, and it's stormy, it's dark, and they see nothing but water, and waves are really just shaking that boat. Oh, those men had to be terribly, terribly, terribly frightened. Think about it. So they're in the middle of the sea. It says here in verse 24, the ship was tossed with waves, and the wind was contrary. In the fourth watch of the night, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., it says that Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Wow. Now let's look at Mark's version of this. Mark said this in Mark 6, 47 and 48. Mark said, and when even was come, the ship was now in the midst of the sea, and he alone was on the land. So the disciples were in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the sea, in the middle of the night, and Jesus was on that mountain or on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch, that is again between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. of the night, he cometh to them walking on the sea. And so then we see that he is the very thing, I want you to see here, the very, very thing that was frightening those disciples was the sea. Think about it. It was the ocean water, not the ocean waters, but the freshwater lake waters. It was the storm making the waters rise, and the waves are rocking the boat, and those disciples are terrified at what the water is doing. They're scared. And the very thing that frightened them, Jesus showed them, was under his feet. So whatever frightens us in life, whatever it is, if it's unemployment, not knowing how we're going to pay the bills, if it's a big surgery coming up, whatever, a sickness, whatever frightens us, it's under his feet. He's got it. He's got it. It's under his feet. So the very thing that will frighten us. And so Jesus comes walking on the water. And you know, when they saw him walking on the water, they very well should have remembered what Isaiah the prophet had written in his book in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. When Isaiah said, it's for you and I, he said, when thou passest through the waters, God says, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. And when thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. They should have remembered the words written by Job in his book, Job chapter 9, verse 8, which says, God alone treadeth upon the waves of the sea. Only God can walk on water. You say, well, wait a minute, Peter did. Yeah, I know, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So we see here then that Jesus comes walking on the sea. He's walking on the water, and it's dark. See, keep in mind that it's 3 to 6 a.m. It's dark, and they see him from a distance coming upon them. And how did they respond? It says they were troubled. I guess they would be troubled. If I was out in the middle of a sea in a storm in a boat, and it's rocking, and I see some man walking on the water, and I can't make out and tell exactly who it is, I'd be troubled too. We all would. So they were troubled. It says here they're probably shaking, and it says they cried out for fear. They said it's a spirit, verse 26. It is a spirit. The word spirit means ghost. They thought it was a ghost. So they said it is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. Why did they not recognize it to be Jesus? I know we'd say because it's dark, but I've got another reason why they didn't know it was Jesus, because they weren't looking for him. They were praying and they were calling out for God to help them. Perhaps they didn't really believe that he would come, so they weren't looking for him. Many times we pray to God, but do we have the faith to really believe he will answer? So they perhaps were not looking for him, and they were frightened. But it says in verse 27, but straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. So he calmed them down. He said, it is I. And they saw that what they were troubled about, what they were fearful of, was under his feet. He had it. He's got it. He's God's son. So Peter, and Matthew's the only one who mentions this. Mark didn't mention this. John didn't mention this. But Matthew does. I guess this was something that stuck out in Matthew's mind, and he remembered. And Matthew said, and I don't see how the other two could not remember it. It's such a dramatic thing. But anyway, still nonetheless, Matthew's the only one to mention it. Verse 28 says, Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, then bid me come unto thee on the water. Let me walk unto you. You call me, and let me come walk unto you. And Jesus said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on water to go to Jesus. Peter's walking on water too. But keep this in mind. He's able to walk and tread on the waters because his eyes were focused on Jesus. He's looking right directly at Jesus. But then, the sounds of the wind and the storm. When he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And then he began to sink, and he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. When we get distracted, the devil is the great distractor. The devil will do anything and everything he possibly can to get our minds and our hearts off of Jesus. And so then when we get our hearts and our minds off of Jesus, and we start looking at our surroundings and our circumstances that are about us, and then we start to sink. And we have to cry out, Lord, help me. And he will help us. But we need to learn to keep our eyes upon Jesus. We need to turn our eyes upon Jesus, look full into his glorious face, and then the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. But it says here, when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand, and he caught him. And he said unto him, O thou of little faith. And we said, well, Jesus was a little hard on Peter, right? He said Peter had no faith, right? No, he didn't say that. He said, O little faith. Peter had faith. No, Peter had more faith than any of the other men in that boat. Because Peter was the only one who had the courage to step into the waters. The others didn't. So let's not be so hard on Peter. Let's not, when we go to heaven one day and we see Peter walking by the pearly gates and down the streets of gold, let's not look him up and say, Peter, can I talk to you and tell you that I'm disappointed in the fact that you sank and you didn't have faith. No, he had faith. But he had little faith. All of us have a little faith, and with a little faith we can see great things happen. But thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Jesus said, why did you start to worry about your surroundings? Why did you all of a sudden start to worry about the circumstances? If you kept your eyes on me, you would have stayed afloat. And immediately Jesus saved him, it says here, verse 32, and when they were coming to the boat, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshiped him. This is the first time mentioned that the disciples worshiped Jesus. They were followers of him, but this is the first time it mentions that they worshiped him. By this time, in Matthew chapter 2, we see the wise men had worshiped him. In Matthew chapter 8, we see that the leper that Jesus healed worshiped him. In Matthew chapter 9, we see the synagogue ruler whose daughter had died and Jesus resurrected. He worshiped him. Now we see the disciples begin to worship him. They said, of a truth thou art the Son of God. And this is the first time that the disciples had referred to Jesus as being the Son of God. Then we see, it says in verse 34, about to wrap this up here tonight. When they were gone over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. Gennesaret was an area of land or a city on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, where the disciples had ultimately ended up going to after they finally made it to the other side of the sea. And when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all the country round about and brought unto him all that were diseased. I don't know if the people there in Gennesaret really knew who Jesus was, but they had perhaps heard of his healing miracles, and they brought people who were sick, and Jesus touched them. And they besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, like the woman with the issue of blood reached out and touched the hem of his garment. Just a little bit of power, as they would just get a little bit of Jesus and touch the hem of his garment, people were made whole. And with just a little bit of power, he was doing great things among them. I imagine what it would have been like with the fullest sense of his power being upon them. And with God, all we need to do, we want to see great things happen in our lives, and just building upon what I've been preaching on Sunday mornings about the revival. We want to see something big, something great happen among us. Just a little bit of his power. If we can just all reach out and touch the hem of his garment, we could see great things happen. We got to have faith and believe, and he can do great miracles among us, just like he did there. I do thank you for listening, and may God bless you. Let us pray.